All right, so with that, our speaker for tonight is Dr. Desiree Narango. She is a current David H. Smith Conservation Research Fellow and postdoctoral researcher at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her research focuses on understanding wildlife and habitat relationships and plant-animal interactions in novel human-dominated landscapes. And she's currently studying habitat and diet relationships of insectivorous migratory birds using urban and urbanizing forests as stopover habitats in New England. And I've been wanting to have Desiree as a guest speaker for a while now. So I'm delighted that she was available to speak to our chapter this evening. So thank you, Desiree, and feel free to share your screen and get started.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hannah. Thanks for the introduction and for the invitation. I'm more than happy to share, to have people listen to me for 40 minutes about my research. Hopefully you see a beautiful blackpoll warbler. So I'm really grateful for this invitation and the chance to share with you a little bit about what these little birds have taught me about the importance of native plants. I'm also happy to have an audience of folks in West Virginia, one of my favorite places to go birding. In fact, some of you may notice my background here is actually Cranberry Glades, another one of my favorite places. I also want to give you two caveats before I talk. So number one, in my title here, I have bird habitat in urban landscapes, but I assure you that there is a very healthy dose of insect ecology and conservation as well in this talk. And the second caveat is that I have a tendency to want to throw information at people. And so if there's anything that you hear tonight and you want to learn more, or you didn't catch it, or you'd like more information, feel free to email me or find me on Twitter. I'm more than happy to follow up and answer your questions. So with that, as an ecologist, I study birds, I study insects, I study plants, and I do this all in human-dominated landscapes, which, if you think about it, are basically everywhere. Because, okay, we should be good now.
Yep, you're good.
All right, great. Sorry about that. So again, human-dominated landscapes. So if you think about it, these landscapes are basically everywhere because to support our human population, we have dramatically and rapidly transformed the world into novel ecosystems. And with all these changes comes really dramatic effects on wildlife habitat as well. And so an ecologist, where I fit in, where my role is really to try to provide conservation solutions or recommendations for how we might manage these habitats in the future of global change so that we can further support our biodiversity. And this is really critical right now. I mean, we see in the news all the time that biodiversity is declining all across taxa. We have 3 billion birds that are missing in the last 50 years. We have insect populations that are declining all around the globe. And I took this phrase actually from an insect paper, but I think it's relevant to all of our biodiversity declines that we're seeing, is that the mechanisms of these declines is what we would call death by 1,000 cuts. And what that means really is that when we see these declines, there's really not just one thing that's contributing to that change. It's really a myriad of different mechanisms that are contributing to loss. And so there was a wonderful paper that came out about insect declines, and they highlighted what some of these mechanisms might be. So of course we have climate change, we have increased droughts, we have more fires or less fires, we have pollution, we have pesticides, we have non-native species, we have agriculture, we have so many things going on. It's kind of overwhelming to think of all the things that are affecting our declines of biodiversity. But I am a conservation optimist. And so when I look at this list, I actually have a little bit of optimism. And the reason for that is that if we look at a lot of these different mechanisms, there's a theme that's commonly thread through lots of different ones, and that is plant communities. And so, when I look at these things, one of the ways that we can simultaneously impact all of these mechanisms, not all of them, but a large proportion of them at the same time, is by rethinking the relationship that we have with plant communities so that we can support biodiversity conservation. So we can directly target agricultural intensification, urbanization, deforestation, all by the way that we think about how we're managing the plants in those landscapes. You know, this is a phrase that I'm sure lots of people have heard before. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. And that could, you know, that has never been more true than right now. Because every single tree that you have had your hand in, have planted, included in properties that you manage or in parks that you like visiting, every one of those trees is a legacy. And so the question that I want you to keep in your mind is, which trees are going to be a part of your legacy? Because when we're making these decisions about what kind of trees or plants to have in our yards or in our other managed properties, we have lots of different values that are going into that decision making. So we need to plant trees that are appropriate for local conditions. We need to plant trees that satisfy our own personal needs and values. We also want to address climate, future climates, and plant trees that are adapted to those future climates as well. And so, you know, what I see as the challenge for me as the ecologist, what I'm trying to do is to make sure that biodiversity conservation is also a part of that equation for you, so that I can arm you with the tools that you need to make sure that in that tree selection, that you're also selecting things that will increase the value of the wildlife habitat as well. Because the way that you manage plant communities can make really big differences for the quality of that habitat. So from the trees that you cut down, the ones that you plant, how many different kinds, how many times you mow, designer gardens that you create, all of those seemingly small decisions has had the additive effect of completely transforming the habitat for wildlife. And so, sorry, the light went off behind me, so I got messed up. So those seemingly small decisions has really transformed habitat quality for wildlife, but we haven't had a lot of research to address what those changes might be. Hold on 1 second. There we go, much better. And so one of the reasons that plant identity might matter from the insect perspective is because more than 90% of our plant-eating insects are specialists to some degree. And what that means is that these insects have adapted over evolutionary time to feed on very specific host plants for which they've overcome those nasty defensive chemical compounds that are found in the leaf. But they've also adapted to how a plant looks like, its morphology, as well as the timing of that plant as well. And so a wonderful example of this that you may be familiar of is the monarch butterfly, which in its caterpillar form will feed exclusively on milkweed plants. But actually more than 90% of our butterflies and moths are specialized to feed on very specific plants when they're in their caterpillar form. And there's lots of specialization that occurs across insects, from plant hoppers, our beetles, and even our bees can also be pollen specialists as well. And so the identity of the plants that we have in our landscapes can really affect our insect populations. And this specialism can occur in a variety of different ways. So here are of a couple examples in our moth group. So we have the rosy maple moth, which, as it says in its name, feeds exclusively on trees from the maple genus, but it actually really likes sugar maple. That's one of its favorite species. So if you want to have rosy maple moth in your yards and your properties, then you want to have those maple trees. Moths and butterflies can also exhibit regional specialization. So one example of this is a Promethea moth, which is a large silk moth that's about the size of my hand. Beautiful, beautiful moth. And up here where I am in Massachusetts, our Promethea moths highly prefer trees from the Prunus genus, the cherries. They also prefer sassafras. But if you go down to the mid-Atlantic and probably in those lower elevations in West Virginia as well, the Promethea moths are feeding mostly on tulip trees from the genus Liriodendron. And if you go even farther south into Georgia and Alabama, those same species of Promethea moth are specialized for local magnolia trees. And so it really depends on where you are in this moth's distribution and what trees would be most appropriate to support populations of this species. And then we have things that are considered generalists that specialize on many, many different families of plants, like our saddled prominent, and it feeds on maples, on birches, on beeches, on hickories, on oaks. It feeds on lots of different things. And it may seem like they can use just about anything, but they really don't. And if we look at the number of plants that they feed on relative to all the plants that are out there in your state or your local ecoregion, plus all of the different plants that we've introduced through horticulture and all the different invasive plants, it's really just a fraction of the plant diversity that's out there that this particular species can use. These plant-eating insects, of course, are really important because they're the bridge of energy from the plants to the rest of the food web. And these plant-eating insects, these herbivores, are supporting a vast community of invertebrate consumers like our beetles and our spiders as well. And of course, we're interested in the birds. We're a bird club, so these insects are also critically important for supporting our bird populations. In fact, the majority of birds rely on insects, at least in some point in the annual cycle. And if you look across the globe, so this is all the birds in the world, more than 70% of our songbirds are eating mostly insects. So more than 50% of their diet are insects. And I really want to highlight caterpillars as a particularly important food for birds. In fact, I would call them a superfood because we see again and again in study after study that birds are preferentially feeding on caterpillars over other insect groups. And the reason for that is that caterpillars have a lot of biomass. They have a lot of calories that are a power packet superfood. They have a lot of protein that's also packed into that food, which is important for growing muscles, for growing feathers and bones. They have high carotenoids, which is important for immune function and for making that beautiful red colors that we see in cardinals and yellows and goldfinches. And caterpillars are also have a relatively high detectability because they create a lot of damage in leaves, and they have high predictability too because they have big flushes of food that comes out in certain times of the year that correspond very nicely to times of the year when insects are really important for birds as well. In fact, going back to that 3 billion birds that we lost in the last 50 years, some folks have gone back to look at the different species and which ones were increasing, which ones were declining, and found that for the birds that rely mostly on insects for their diet, most of those species are on average in decline, whereas many of the bird species where insects are not essential to their diet are doing fairly well. So a lot of the granivorous species or aquatic species, they're doing fine. But the ones that are relying on our insect populations are not doing so great. So it suggests that there's a real link between our insect declines and our bird declines, and that our bird conservation is really then intimately connected to insect conservation. But our insect conservation, again, is built on the foundation of plant communities that we cultivate. And so what I propose is that if we really pay attention to the interactions that are happening between plants, insects, and birds, then that can inform our decision-making in these novel ecosystems that we've created. And so I'm going to share with you 2 examples of how I've done this in my research. I actually work across the full annual cycle, but I won't talk about any of my wintering stuff today. But I'm going to share with you a little bit about what I've learned from Carolina chickadees that are breeding in residential yards, and also a little bit about what I'm doing now with my current work with migratory songbirds in urban forests. And so first, one of the first questions that you might have when you're thinking about what sort of plants to have in your yard or in your garden is whether to plant native or non-native species. And so we looked at the Carolina chickadee so that we could test or rather compare what the ecological value is of these two different kinds of plants. And you know, entomologists and myself have looked at this question quite a bit in the past. And what we find is that compared to non-native plants, so these non-native plants are plants that do not have a natural distribution that includes the Eastern United States in my case, or in any case that you're in any region that you're interested in. Native species compared to non-native plants are supporting on average higher species diversity, so higher insect diversity. They're supporting higher abundance of those insects, so more biomass for those birds to eat. And they're especially supporting more of the most specialized species, so these plant-eating insects that rely on particular host plants. And for caterpillars in particular, myself and colleagues have found that native plants support more than 5 times more caterpillar species compared to non-natives, and 2 to 3 times more caterpillar individuals. So again, more bird food is available on these native plants. And so given that there's a difference in food availability, we wanted to see whether that actually translated into consequences for any insect-eating birds that were breeding in habitats where non-native plants are dominant. And one of those places where non-native plants can be extremely common and make up a lot of the plant biomass that's out there is in residential yards. And that's not necessarily because they're overrun with invasive plants, but mostly because of decisions that are made through horticulture. So lots of non-native street trees, a lot of ornamental species that are planted in yards because they're beautiful and easy to maintain, are potentially impacting the insect availability for these birds to eat. And so we worked, this was during my PhD work, where I worked with Doug Tallamy at University of Delaware and Pete Mara at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, now at Georgetown. And we really wanted to use this chickadee as a model species to ask whether native plants provide better habitat for birds. And one of the reasons why the chickadee is a wonderful species to ask this question is in part because we know just how important insects are to their diet. In fact, insects make up more than 90% of the chickadee's diet during the breeding season. And there was a study way back in the day where they found that during the time when they're feeding nestlings, these chickadees are feeding almost 400 to almost 600 caterpillars per day to feed that little clutch of chickadees. And these chickadees are feeding their young for about at least 16 days before they fledge. So it's taking thousands and thousands and thousands of chickadees or caterpillars just to feed one little clutch of chickadees. So this is one little 10-gram bird, 10 little paper clips in your hand. So think about how many caterpillars it's going to take to feed your cardinals and your blue jays and your grackles and all these different kinds of things. The chickadee is also a really wonderful species because they readily use nest boxes. So we were able to put these PVC tube nest boxes that were in people's yards so we could attract the birds to nest and then see how they're doing. And we could also do lots of different supplementary data collection, like catching birds, so we could follow them around, so we could assess their body condition, assess how big they are, how much fat they have, all kinds of fun things. This is the part of the talk where I define what I mean by non-native. So I mentioned before, when we say non-native, it's something that doesn't have a distribution in your area. But for the purposes of this study, we considered anything non-native that, or rather, we considered plants native if they had a distribution that included the Eastern United States. So any plants that had a distribution just in the Western United States or in different countries, they were all considered non-native. That may not be the definition that you use for native and non-native, because you may be interested in something that's more regionally native. But for the purposes of this study, that's what we use, because that's what we expected would be the most influential for both insects and birds. And the other thing to keep in mind is in everything that we're looking at, we weren't really interested in the number of species or the number of trees. We were really interested in the actual foliage biomass that was out there. And so we used a lot of forestry measurements so that we could calculate how much leaf material that was in these birds' territories that were native and non-native. And so one of the things that we found when we followed these chickadees around is that they overwhelmingly preferred native trees for foraging. So most of the territories that we followed foraged mostly in native trees, and the non-native trees were almost completely avoided as if they weren't even there. And so, but another thing that was really interesting and what we found is that they weren't just choosing native trees. They were choosing native trees that we knew were highly productive for supporting caterpillars. And so we actually had data on the number of caterpillar species that are expected to be found or that are known to use different plants. And we grabbed that from the literature so that we could have a quantitative measure of productivity. And what we found was this really nice linear relationship in our native trees, where the more caterpillar species that a tree supports, the more that those birds were preferring those species relative to others that were within its territory. And we saw that chickadees had a much lower preference for non-native plants, and that relationship was also much weaker. So these non-native plants were just not reliable as a foraging substrate for this species. And what they were really honing in on are these trees that support lots of different caterpillar species like oaks, maples, cherries, elms, and hickories. We also looked at these birds while they were breeding so that we could see how many young that they were producing and how well those baby birds were doing. And what we found, just to take years and years of data and number crunching and put it into one slide, is that Carolina chickadees preferred breeding in yards that had more native plants. So that was our most strongest relationship, that if you had more native plants in your yard, you were more likely to have a breeding chickadee. They were more likely to be there. The males that took those territories were also more likely to attract a female as well. So we had some males that had set up shop in a completely non-native dominated yard, and they just sang their hearts out and never got a female, and it was very, very sad. We also found that if the birds were nesting in these yards, the nestlings were growing faster, and they were in far better condition if the yards were dominated in native plants too. So not only are they attracting the birds, but the nestlings are also getting more food, and they're in better condition and growing faster. And finally, what we found is that the territories where these birds were breeding with more native plants were also fledging more young. So they were being more productive during reproduction compared to birds that were trying to breed in these non-native plant dominated yards. And so going farther though, beyond just reproduction, because that's only one part of a bird's life cycle, we wanted to see whether that actually made a difference for population sustainability in these chickadees. And so in order to calculate population trends or population growth, we have to get a lot of different data. So we had data on reproduction, which was how many eggs did they lay? Did they have a nest? How many young did they fledge? We also had data on adult survival. So for the purposes of this model, it was how likely is a female going to survive from year 1 to year 2? And then our last thing that we had was juvenile survival. So this is actually for the little baby birds when they leave the nest. What is the likelihood that they will survive the 21 days after they leave the nest before they become independent and go off to get their own territories? So we plugged all those different numbers into a population growth equation. And just to orient you to this graph right here, this dotted line here is considered replacement. And so that means that birds are producing enough young to sustain a local population, to replace the ones that are dying. And so you would expect that a sustainable chickadee population would fluctuate around 0. And so what we found when we plugged all these numbers in is as non-native plants were increasing in dominance within these residential yards, chickadee population growth was predicted to strongly decline. In fact, it declined, it only overlapped replacement when we were less than 10% of non-native plant biomass. But you know, we plugged in a lot of different numbers. So what we were actually interested in was not just the overall trend that we were seeing, but whether we could find a threshold. And the reason we were interested in this threshold is because we were asking for people, is there a goal? Is there a goal that we should strive for, or a recommendation that we could offer that could help people improve their yards for insectivorous birds? And so what we found is that where this, what we call a confidence interval, so this is really just the variance in this relationship, where it fails to overlap 0 is at 30% non-native plants. And so what that means is that if you have less than 30% non-native plants, or in other words, more than 70% native plants, the birds have some chance of producing enough young to support a sustainable population. But once you get over that number, once we get over to more than 30% non-native plants, the chances of that happening are very close to 0. So if you want to improve your habitat for insectivorous birds, if you can aim for less than 30% of that non-native plant biomass, you're taking the right steps, or taking the steps in the right direction towards improving your habitat for insectivorous birds. You know, when I presented this data, we were really excited about it. And there were a lot of folks that were really excited about that number too, because we were actually providing an explicit recommendation. But the problem with this is, or not the problem, but then the question that comes up after that is, what does that mean though? What does that mean for me if I'm trying to plant something in my yard? What does aiming for 70% native plants mean? And so we calculated this, and this is a little bit back of the envelope based on some of our average values for the data we collected in this system. And so for an average, you know, quarter-acre yard with the amount of trees and shrubs that are appropriate for attracting chickadees there, if you want to get to 70% native plant biomass, that would equate to something like having 4 large trees in your yard. So about 50 centimeters diameter, which is about what an oak tree is after 50 years. But you could also have 7 to 8 medium-sized trees. So something that's more like a 10 to 20-year tree at 25 centimeters diameter. Or you could have 15 to 16 small trees or shrubs, or you could have some combination of all of that. All of that is really to get at about 200 centimeters of woody biomass. If you can get there, then you're in the right direction towards a 70% native plant biomass. But we recognize that chickadees aren't using just a quarter acre in order to feed their young. So in order for us to really create good habitat for birds, we need to scale up. So that involves getting your neighbors on board too. So if you can get all those folks around you to also plant trees and shrubs and things in their yard, native trees for these birds, then we're really going to start creating habitat that'll make a difference for not just this bird, but any other bird that relies on insects as well. So that's all I have about the breeding work, comparing native and non-native plants with the chickadees. I'm happy to share with you more. We did lots of stuff in that system. But now I want to pivot a little bit and talk about what we've looked at with, or rather what I'm working on now with the migratory birds. And so before I start talking about the birds, though, I have to go back and talk about the insects again. So one thing to keep in mind is that even just among native trees, these they're varying in caterpillar diversity. So, you know, if we compare the oak trees, which are supporting more than 500 different species of caterpillars, to the tulip tree that's only supporting about 10 species of caterpillar, that's a very big difference in the amount of insect diversity that it's supporting. And so my advisor, Doug, and I, and our colleague, Kimberly Shropshire, were actually interested in quantifying all of this data for tons and tons of plant genera across the United States. And after years of crunching all this very old entomological literature. We came up with a huge data set of 25 different states across the United States, where we actually quantify the number of species that are found in every woody and herbaceous plant that are found within that state. And what we found when we looked at all the numbers across the United States is something really surprising, is that most of the caterpillar diversity that's out there is being supported by very few plants. In fact, only 14% of the plants that are out there are supporting more than 90% of the butterflies and the moths that these caterpillars turn into. The other thing that we found across the United States is that oaks are a disproportionately important plant for supporting caterpillar diversity, no matter where you are, whether you're in Massachusetts or West Virginia or out in California. Oaks are considered a keystone species because they are supporting on average more than 20% of the caterpillar diversity, whereas the average amount that a plant is supporting is less than 1%. So if you really want to get a head start on supporting insect diversity, you really can't go wrong with planting an oak tree. And so, when we published that paper, we were like, okay, oaks are clearly important for the caterpillars. Birds eat caterpillars, so it must be that oaks are probably really important for birds too. And we posited that, but we haven't actually tested that yet. And so that's where my research is going now, is to really test what is the influence of these keystone plants that are supporting high numbers of caterpillars for our birds. And we have some, well, not we, but a colleague of mine, Eric Wood, had some previous data from Wisconsin that suggested that oaks are highly, highly preferred by birds during migration. And so in this forest in Wisconsin, they looked at about 14 different species of trees. And in the middle here are the red and the white oak trees, which are above and beyond more preferred than any other of the deciduous and conifer trees that were in this forested system relative to availability. I also had an undergrad that was interested in whether oaks were important from the caterpillar's perspective in terms of mortality. And so what he did was actually this really clever experiment where he put out these clay caterpillar models on different species of trees. And he did it in the spring and the summer and the fall. And he wanted to see whether the mortality of these caterpillars from birds changed within the different seasons. And what he found is that no matter what season that you were in, caterpillar mortality was the highest on our oak trees relative to any of the other trees that he studied. And the highest mortality was happening in the summer, a little bit less mortality happening in the spring, and the lowest mortality was happening in the fall. Another way to think about this from the bird's perspective is that the highest mortality of caterpillars is happening in the summer when the largest number of bird species are breeding. The next highest mortality is happening during spring migration, but really not that much different. And the lowest mortality is happening during fall migration when birds have ceased their breeding and they're often switching to other food resources such as fruit. So I thought this was a really interesting, really elegant study done by a really stellar student. That really showed kind of how, or at least alluding to how diets might be changing over the course of these seasons. And it also suggests that the caterpillars that we're actually finding on these trees, on these oak trees, we find more caterpillars on them, but it's really just the residue of what birds haven't eaten yet. And so these trees are supporting a lot more than we really know. And so what about migration? So there's lots and lots of different species out there that are migrating and they're moving from the rainforests of Central and South America. They're moving up through the United States, up to the boreal forests of Canada. And during their migration, they need to stop and rest and refuel along the way. And they can stop in habitats that they've never seen before, areas that they've never used. And these are areas that they don't breed in. They just stop, they get food, and they make it along their way. And so some of the things that these birds are experiencing while they're moving through these landscapes during migration is they're potentially coming in contact with urban habitats and urban forests, which can have anthropogenic hazards. They can also have less food resources. They can have artificial light that can attract them into hazardous areas. And then the other thing that I'm really interested in from a forestry perspective is that urban forest tree communities, even when they're dominated by native trees, are completely novel compositions. So up here in Massachusetts, most of our forests should be dominated by oak trees. But if you go into these urban forests, which have been left behind when the city was developed, they cut all the oak trees down, they let everything go crazy. And now we have these forests that are dominated by poplars, maple trees, pine trees, and just definitely not the same assemblage that was there 100 years ago or 200 years ago. So these urban forests can have low food resources just from being urban, but they can also have affected food resources just by the changing tree compositions as well. And so what I'm really working on with this project is whether oak trees are influencing the refueling habitat for these migratory insectivorous birds. Another way to think about this is, can we mitigate the negative effects of urbanization by planting more oak trees? And this is something that urban foresters are really interested in, is trying to replicate some of the oak silviculture that we see in rural areas. Especially in West Virginia, you have lots of oak silviculture. We're trying to replicate some of those same activities, but in urban forests, so that we can create healthier forests, but we can also create timber economies as well within the city. And so what I've done in this project is to find a lot of sites that are both within the city and outside the city. This is in Springfield, Massachusetts. Not as big as Boston, but pretty big in its own right. And the sites are separated into urban and non-urban sites, and they're also separated into high oak dominated sites and low oak dominated sites. So we have a nice even mix of our variables here. And in each one of these sites, we're putting out acoustic recording units so that we can record the vocalizations of birds, so we can get information about when they show up and how many are there. And we can do that simultaneously at all these sites during migration, which is really powerful. And then we're also capturing the birds so that we can take blood and fecal samples from these migratory birds while they're using these habitats. And of course, also doing some very intensive tree and insect sampling as well. And we're sampling not just the caterpillars and things that are found on the trees, but we're also sampling what they're finding in the leaf litter in the soil, and also the flies that are moving around in the air as well. So like I said, we're capturing the birds so that we can collect these blood and these poop samples. We do so as safely as we can, and everyone is very trained in order to do so. And the reason that we collect these samples is so that we can look at both their diet and the condition of these birds. And so one of the ways that we're looking at diet is by actually doing DNA sequencing on the poop samples so that we can see all the different insect species that these birds were feeding on. We can also get information about the plants that they were using as well. We also use their blood samples so that we can look at carbon and nitrogen, and that gives us some information about what kind, the proportion of different insects that they're eating, how much fruit they're eating. And then the other simultaneous thing that we're able to do with the blood samples as well is to look at something called plasma metabolites, which are basically a really nice way of measuring how fast is that bird putting on fat. Because these birds are migrating, they're looking for food. They want to put on fat as fast as possible so they can make their way in their journey. So we're able to have a quantitative measure of how well these birds are doing at these different sites. And so last year was the first year that we did this study, and we captured birds in spring and fall of 2021. You know, we caught between those two seasons more than 1,000 migratory individuals from more than 30 different species. which I think is impressive. But if any of you folks here are banders, you may be like, wow, that's not that many birds at all for a migration site. And it turns out that when you don't band in an area that's not already a migration hotspot, it's actually really hard to catch birds, and especially in the forest where the trees are really high. So we actually, we don't have as many nets up because we're trying to process the birds very quickly as soon as we get them. And we're also using playback so that we can get them to come out of the canopy and down into the net. So our numbers are quite a bit lower, but we get a lot of diversity and we get a lot of warblers, which is really nice. You know, I'm still crunching the data. I'm still looking at it, but there's definitely some clear differences in both the bird community that are using these forests in the spring and fall, as well as the insect communities. So the food that's available is very different in the fall than what is available in the spring. We're also finding some surprising phenology or timing differences between the urban and the rural forests. And so we actually have our trees are actually leafing out about 2 weeks earlier in the city than they are in the country. And this is over a very short gradient, about 15 kilometers, which is not very far at all. Another thing that's been really interesting at this site is that despite having abundant fruit, we have lots of different fruiting species of plants. There's surprisingly little apparent frugivory. And when I say apparent, I mean, when I look at the poop sample, it doesn't have seeds and it doesn't have pulp and it's not staining my fingers purple. And so there's not as much frugivory in the fall as I thought that there would be. And there's really only a handful of species that are doing most of the fruit eating. And so we're currently processing a lot of these samples. So you'll just have to keep an eye out for results in the future. These are a few of the different species that we have are getting good numbers on, especially in the fall. So for our insectivores, we get things like ruby-crowned kinglet, common yellow-throat, northern parula, black and white, blackpoll. And I also are considering white-throated sparrows as an insectivore for the purposes so far until we look at the actual data in their diet, because they're one of those species that we almost never were finding fruit in their diet, which was really, really surprising to me. And then some of the frugivores that we've been are getting good numbers on are yellow-rumped warbler, hermit thrush, Swainson's thrush, and gray catbird. We're also getting good numbers on red-eyed vireo, which is I'm putting over here in the frugivore section because that's one of the species that surprisingly always has fruit in its diet. So every single red-eyed vireo that we caught had tons and tons of fruit in their diet in the fall. So I think once we have that real fine scale diet information, we'll have an important piece of the puzzle to fit into this as well. And in the data that I've looked at so far, you know, I'm just starting to look at getting the lab work done, but we do have condition data. So how heavy is the bird relative to its body size? And so some of the things that we're starting to see in the data, so this is some models that I've run recently, including those 10 or so species that I just showed you, we're seeing some things that they're not super surprising, but are really interesting to see in this community, which is for species that are suspected to be heavily insectivorous, such as the blackpoll warbler. Their condition is much lower in urban forests and also in forests that have really low oak dominance, suggesting that both the plant community and urbanization might be reducing food availability for a primarily insect-eating species. Whereas something like the Swainson's thrush, which eats lots of fruit in the fall, they are actually in better condition in urban forests and in better condition when oaks are lower because there's more of those fruit-eating species. So it really depends on what species you're looking at and whether an urban forest is a suboptimal habitat for a migratory bird or a really, really awesome habitat. But there's nuance that appears in this community as well. So our red-eyed vireos, despite eating all that fruit, are actually in pretty poor condition. And our black and white warblers, even though they're suspected to be eating mostly insects, are eating a lot, or are actually in really good condition in urban forests. So there's a lot of nuance that I think is going to be really alleviated once we identify what exactly kinds of insects are these birds eating. and what proportion of their diet is fruit and insects. So with that, stay tuned. We will have more results, hopefully in the near future, to share with you. But scientists are really slow, so don't let my slowness stop you from making decisions. We already have enough information to suggest that planting native plants that have lots of insects are probably going to be really awesome for supporting migratory birds. So if you want to make a difference, you can definitely do that. I definitely went over, so I'm going to skip ahead here, but well, really, this is just the take home. So, what I want you to remember from this talk is that plants vary in their contributions to insects and also to birds. You can manage habitat for wildlife by planting these native and caterpillar productive plants that create functional, ecologically functional habitat for birds. And then finally, we have a lot more to learn about migrants. So again, stay tuned and keep a lookout. So I'll take any questions that you have, and thank you for hanging in there. Sorry, I went a little bit over, but hope you learned something today.
Thank you, Desiree. So if you guys do have questions, as a reminder, you can write your question in the chat box and I can read it out loud. You can raise your hand using the little reaction doodad at the bottom of the Zoom screen, or you can write in the chat box that you would like to ask your question and I can unmute you. I'll lead off with a question. How do you think birds recognize like native tree species?
That's a good question. So, one way to think about it is, are they recognizing that they're native trees? Probably not. What they're recognizing is that there's insect on those trees. And so, actually, birds use a lot of different cues to find where insects are. They can see when caterpillars eat leaves, it actually creates a UV damage that the birds can see. There's also some evidence that birds can sense the chemical compounds that trees give off when they're being damaged. So they're smelling what trees have a lot of insects. But they also, if you follow a chickadee around, they do a lot of exploratory foraging. And then when they find a good tree, they just keep going back to the same one. So they're doing a lot of that too, where they're looking to see, where are the insects for me to eat? And so when you're a scientist coming out, the probability of you actually finding a bird in a non-native tree is really low, because the only time that they're really there is when they're exploring, looking for food and then not finding any.
Cool. Does anyone else have any questions? I have another question. For those little clay caterpillars, you're looking at peck marks, I assume? Like how you tell the mortality?
Yeah, so with the clay caterpillars, when a bird makes a damage mark on the caterpillar, it looks like a little triangle. And so you can say that a bird attacked that caterpillar. And so what Garrison did was he went out every single day and checked all the caterpillars that he put out. And if he found a peck mark on them, then he considered that caterpillar dead and he removed it. And then over the course of his experiment, he could see how many had survived and what their probability of surviving was. And there's other things that attack these clay caterpillars, like a mammal could eat it, and we had to throw that out because we don't care about squirrels. But yeah, that's how we use them. It's a very fun experiment. It's very easy for people to do. It's wonderful for kids. They love doing that. If you're looking for activities, we put clay caterpillars out for my son and he checks them.
Does anyone else have questions? Surely I'm not the only one. Okay. Do you want to read it, or do you want me to read it to you?
You can read it.
Okay. All right. So let's see. So in areas of non-native plants, sometimes with non-native insects along with them, what is actually eating or decomposing everything?
In terms of the non-native plant material, I assume that you're asking. So yeah, so occasionally you know, when we have like invasive plants, it's not as if they don't have anything on them, right? So it's not as if they're devoid of life. And often when we import non-native plants, eventually we import the insects that were found on them and they go crazy. And so like one example of this is the euonymus caterpillar, which I'm not sure if it's in West Virginia, but we've been planting euonymus tree or shrubs for a long, long time. And then we finally imported the caterpillar and now they go crazy and they eat everything and, you know. So there are non-native plant insects that are on non-native plants. There are some native insects that can use non-native plants. It's just that relative to the native species, it's a lot fewer. And so one of the things that happens is that, you know, if there's a non-native plant, and let's say it has lots of aphids and stuff on it, well, the birds aren't necessarily feeding on those plants to keep those insect populations down. And so they can go a little crazy too. And so that's a really important to think about is in all of this work that we've done where we are using observations to look at insects, we're looking at the residue of what birds didn't eat. And so we're actually underestimating the insects that are on plants and overestimating what's on these non-native plants because nothing is eating them and those insects are allowed to go wild, you know, crazy. So hopefully that answered your question, but let me know if you're looking for more information.
And then looks like a follow-up question. So the statement is, I haven't totally paid attention to the biomes of non-native microhabitats, but do they sort of create their own unique habitats with native and non-native species?
So it sort of depends. So lots of different non-native plants can behave in different ways. So a lot of the ones in horticulture are pretty benign. They haven't escaped our gardens yet. A lot of them don't reproduce. Really, they're just not doing anything but looking pretty. There's some invasive plants, especially where they've escaped, they homogenize the understory of a forest, they can change the soil composition, they can bring different microbes and fungus with them that can change which plants are allowed to be there, they can facilitate other invasive plants coming in, or they can have something like we call allelopathy, which is basically like a chemical that makes all the rest of the plants not be able to grow in that soil. And so they can change habitats in all kinds of ways. There's someone up here who studies garlic mustard, which is just a tiny little herbaceous flower, but because it completely transforms the soil conditions and the shade conditions for like other ephemeral spring flowers, there's a lot of other native plants that can't use those habitats. So it's in our best interest to not just plant a lot of native plants, but try to remove the invasive plants especially, and those non-native plants that aren't doing anything at all. And the other thing to keep in mind is that with these non-natives that seem like they're not invasive or not causing a lot of ecological havoc, there is a lag that happens. So an example of this is viburnum. Oh, it's not coming to me. It's a type of viburnum that in New Jersey, so it was introduced in horticulture over 150 years ago, and it's never done anything. All you do is just plant it in your yard and it sits there and it doesn't spread, it doesn't do anything. And then something changed. Maybe the winters got a little bit warmer in New Jersey and it escaped into the forest and now is completely overrunning the forest in some areas of New Jersey. And so just because something isn't invasive now doesn't mean that it might not go out of control later on. There's a lot of consequences that we may not be able to anticipate. So it's in our best interest for the plant community to plant native plants, and then also for the birds and the insects as well.
Anyone else have any questions? All right, well,